Hello everyone, in this tutorial we'll be talking about Sitecore GraphQL queries. We will use Sitecore Playground to check our queries, to test them and check if Sitecore is returning data. Then we use Postman. We can use Postman as well to test our queries. And finally we'll create an API request from Azure Function to simulate a situation where in your integration layer you want to read data from Sitecore, use it in your business logic. So we will test this scenario as well. So let's jump into Visual Studio and make some requests. So before we create Visual Studio function, we will do a couple of tests. We will use Sitecore Playground to test our queries. You can find Sitecore Playground going to this URL, Edge Sitecore Cloud API GraphQL IDE. And here you've got three windows actually. This is the window where you are adding your queries. At the bottom you have query parameters in a JSON format. Then you've got HTTP headers where you will be adding your Sitecore API key. And on the right hand side here, you will be getting a result. So when you press this play button, Sitecore will send you back a JSON response to your request. So as you can see, our first test will bring back basically the home item and the full layout that we can debug and check if everything is returned from Sitecore. We can check if all the components are returned and all the details that we wanted to return. So we can basically debug our issues. And for example, if on the front-end side something is not displayed or there are some errors, we can check if the data is sent to front-end application correctly. We can send a simple request that will give us a response with all the details, and we can check if this is the response that we would expect. So that's the first thing that we can do. And obviously here in your test your queries, you can add a lot of extra fields. I will show you a different query that is bringing child items of a specific item. So for example, if you want to bring, for example, child items of a blog section on your website, you can do it by specifying the item ID. So this is the content item ID. And as I said, you can put these parameters here in your query variables and change them and make this query function. In here we are getting children, and I'm interested only to bring item ID and template ID. And as you can see on the right hand side, we have a list of item IDs, template IDs. So this is the way you can test your queries. You can write your queries and make sure that your query is valid and Sitecore is actually returning data. So now let's move on to Visual Studio, where we have a simple Azure function it's a HTTP triggered function. I want to make a call within this function to Sitecore and bring back data for my item. And what I will be sending to Sitecore is a query that I showed you before, which is a query that will bring me all the children of the blog section. And I'm specifying the item in Sitecore, the parent item, and I will be bringing back all the children of this item. So I have this in settings. So query is a simple string. I copied from Playground, and I'm using the same query that I used in Playground for this example. I have a class GraphQL request where I'm specifying query, where I'm specifying variables. I will be serializing this into a JSON string. I'll show you this in a second. In create request function, where I'm passing this object and I'm serializing, as I said, the content of it. I'm specifying the API URL. I can show you my settings in my configuration. I have a settings class. You can keep it in my app configs, but the URL that you will be using is API GraphQL version 1. This is your API key, and this is my item ID that I want to use as a parent item, and I want to bring all the children. So the next thing I need to do is to add HTTP header, and I'm adding Sitecore API key. Again, I'm keeping this in my settings. And once I have this HTTP request message, I can send it using HTTP client, and I will wait to see the response. So if I run it and I open up my Postman, and then if I make a request to my endpoint, which is API get Sitecore item, I can debug my Azure function. And if I get to this point, as you can see, this is our request. We are sending this using HTTP client, and the status response is okay, it's 200. And then if we take a look at the message that was sent to us, this is a JSON string So this is a list of children of the parent item that I specified here. So now you can deserialize it to specific objects and use it in your application. So if we take a look at GraphQL request model, it's a class where I specified a query, operation name and variables, and we will be adding query variables to this object and serializing it before sending this to Sitecore API. Now, if we want to send a similar request to Postman, I can show you how to do this as well for kind of debugging purposes. And if you want to have a collection of requests that you are sending to Sitecore and keep it as a little documentation, you can use it as well. In terms of sending requests to Sitecore from Postman, you can specify the URL, which is API GraphQL v1, which is the same as I showed you in my Sitecore settings. In headers, we need to add Sitecore API key. So again, we are doing this in Azure Function programmatically, but here we need to specify this and add it so our request will be valid. And the final thing is body, where we are specifying the full JSON that I'm sending to Sitecore. I'm creating this as a C# class first, as an object, and then I'm serializing it. And here we can add a JSON object with query, operation, name, variables. And again, as you can see, the structure is the same as my class and object that I created in Azure Function. So if I send this request to Sitecore, I will be getting back just an item ID because this is what I specified in my query. But in terms of sending a JSON format to Sitecore, if you want to debug your implementation in Visual Studio, you can use this as well. And as I said, you can use Postman collection as your little documentation. So I wanted to show you that you can do it as well. In this tutorial, we talked about Sitecore GraphQL queries. We've used Playground to test our queries to make sure that Sitecore returns data and our queries are valid. Then we've implemented an API that talks to Sitecore API to bring data from Sitecore, so then we can use it in our business logic. I used Azure Function to implement this API, but you can use a web API or even different technology depending on your implementation. And finally, we checked how to use Postman to send these requests and test, validate, and debug our requests from Postman. We can also use Postman to keep a little documentation with all the requests that we are sending to Sitecore. So that's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I see you in the next one.